Welcome to a postseason extra episode of What Do You Mean God Speaks? But some housekeeping is in order. First, I had an interesting conversation about, Christian conversations with the kind hosts of the Back to One podcast. You can listen to that over the span of 2 episodes in their podcast. Part 1 is up now, and Part 2 will be up next Friday. I will put the link to their website in the episode description. But I wanted to take the opportunity here to clarify certain things that came up in that episode. So first, I briefly mentioned a student of mine in that episode who responded to my commentary on political polarization with the point that the left hasn't really done things wrong. Which isn't quite right. I oversimplified his point for the sake of brevity, but he was much more nuanced than that. His position was that though there are some serious problems in the left, what the right in the US has done, such as storming the Capitol, has no equivalence in the left. So I wanted to set that straight because that was kind of bothering me. And second, the host at the Back to One podcast introduced me as a lecturer at the St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto, which I was when my book was being published, which is where they got the information from. I am currently listed, though, as an adjunct faculty at the Wycliffe College, also at the University of Toronto, because, that's how it is with us, rootless contract faculty. Anyway, speaking of that book, in this episode, I will be reading from some selections from the beginning of that very book, God at the Crossroads of Worldviews. Now, I'm doing this partly because the book introduces some of the philosophical underpinnings of what I've been doing in this podcast in this first season, and partly because I mentioned the book before. And besides, this is an easier thing to do that I can do between seasons. The copyright for the book, by the way, belongs to the University of Notre Dame Press and not me, the author, because that's how things like this work. But the selections that I will be reading from are also in the preview from their own website, so it should be okay. It's publicity for them too. So the other thing is that when the Notre Dame Press published my book, they turned all my footnotes into endnotes, and I meant those to be read alongside the main text, and putting them at the end of the book makes them harder to read. So I will be reading the book to you as how I've originally meant the book to be read. Hopefully, that'll be something for people who already read the book. So, this is Paul Sung-ho-jung reads God at the Crossroads of Worldviews. Preface. Sometimes, while listening to two parties arguing intensely, one begins to realize that they are not exactly talking about the same thing. The differences may be subtle, but the points they raise, things they emphasize, the nuances in their reasoning, or the way they use certain words seem a bit off from each other. Then the disconcerting thought eventually dawns that their argument will not end. It cannot end, because in a sense, it never really began. This is what I increasingly sensed when I delved into the intellectual debate regarding religious beliefs years ago. This book slowly took its shape as I examined where this sense was coming from. Our world is increasingly gripped with the questions about God, or to be precise, about religious beliefs in God. As I write this preface, the world is abuzz with a question regarding the role of religious beliefs, and in particular, the beliefs of the monotheistic religions of the West, in wars, violence, and intolerance against minorities of every kind. And pulsing underneath that cacophony is the question of the irrationality of such beliefs. Yet what I have experienced in my life was not an easy dichotomy of, on the one hand, irrationality and intolerance of the religious, a term which itself is notoriously difficult to define and I think too often used in whatever way that best befits one's polemic, and on the other hand, the rationality and liberation of the secular, nor vice versa, I would rightly add. Rather, I encountered a bewildering spectrum of both rationality and irrationality, both intolerance and liberation from both sides. This may be the main reason why we still engage and struggle in intellectual debate regarding religious beliefs. After all, it would be difficult to do so, at least sincerely, when one simply assumes the rationality of oneself and the irrationality of the other. In this book, I begin with one of the axiomatic questions in these debates. Does God exist? And the different reasons for the answers to that question. There are other questions, those more closely wedded to the more urgent social issues that I want to explore eventually in subsequent books. But the journey begins here, and the rest of the story will unfold from this point. What I will propose in this book is that our conception of how we ought to proceed in the debate about the existence of God needs to change. Or to put it more provocatively, though perhaps imprecisely, we are asking the wrong question when we ask, does God exist? Or at least, we are posing it in ways that prevent fruitful discussion and obscure the ways of reaching further answers. That is, what it is we are really asking by the question, does God exist, in an intellectual debate, is not actually, does God exist? What then is the question? So I return to the same disconcerting thought with which we began. In our questions rest the seeds of our answers. Yet we cannot ask the right question, let alone answer it, if those involved are in significant ways talking past each other. To begin, we must find crossroads. This is a different debate about God I eventually envisioned in this book, a different way of thinking about and arguing for or against the existence of God. However, it turned out, rather surprisingly, that such crossroads will not be common standards of reasoning or bodies of facts on the basis of which different sides may argue. Rather, in the debate I envision, the argument for the existence of God is the endeavor to find and stand at the crossroad of particular worldviews involved in the debate in order to forge a way forward. Yet, God at the crossroad is not yet God of the theist. Rather, this, quote, God extends beyond the horizon seen from the crossroad, a horizon toward which those who met at the crossroad in this debate must journey together, and what this horizon will turn out to be will remain unanswered until much, much further on. This may seem a very strange suggestion. This book traverses through a wide range of topics, from contemporary debate about the existence of God, to conceptions of rationality and intellectual inquiry, to the concept of worldviews, to Thomistic theology, to the historical emergence of modern atheism, all in order to arrive at that point. Some books contain one or more chapters one can skip. This is not such a book. Each chapter leads to the next, and the conclusion remains but a proposal, a hope at a point in a story that is still being told. Chapter 1. To step back. Rethinking the question. There is something odd in the way we argue about the existence of God. Let us, however, begin with a parable. Suppose two explorers came upon some natives in the New World performing an esoteric ritual in which each adult male enters a secluded enclosure to offer a token of petition. One explorer says that a benevolent ruler must govern these natives and grant their wishes. Furthermore, this ruler must be benevolent by the very definition of what he is, not because he merely happens to be charitable or kind. The other explorer is skeptical and says that such a ruler does not exist. He then asks to meet this ruler in person, but no one seems able to arrange a meeting. He also finds that the petitions are not always granted and often remain unanswered. He even learns that though, and at times even because, this ruler supposedly governs their world, they experience poverty, disasters, and wars. How then, the skeptic finally asks his colleague, can he still say that the benevolent ruler of these natives exists? How can our explorers resolve this disagreement? Perhaps they can talk to more natives to examine their claims or set up some tests. It may be that although not all petitions are granted, a significant number are. Perhaps other compelling evidences or arguments support the existence of the benevolent ruler. What if there are no such proofs or arguments? Then perhaps the believer ought to acknowledge that the benevolent ruler of the natives does not exist. Or perhaps he may argue instead that this belief is somehow not a matter of rational discourse, but of feeling or picture preference. He may even insist that this belief can be understood only within the context of a particular mode of living practiced by the natives, a mode to which his colleague is an outsider. A side note, this position, for example, is presented by Peter Winch in his book The Idea of a Social Science regarding the non-scientific belief in witchcraft by the Azande tribe. This is largely the way we have gone about arguing about the existence of God. However, let us shift our perception of this parable. Suppose the context of this debate is actually as follows. The skeptic comes from a feudal society, rather like medieval Europe or the feudal Japanese shogunate, and the believer is from a representative democracy similar to that of, say, early 19th century United States. Moreover, and this is important, neither explorer has any notion of other forms of socio-political organization. What the believer believes he saw in the esoteric ritual was the natives participating in an election or a referendum. The benevolent ruler he speaks of is the president, or rather, the holder of the highest democratically elected office, whose government is, by definition, of the people, by the people, for the people, representing and upholding the will, or the wishes, of those who vote for him. The benevolence of the ruler for the believer is defined solely in these terms. What he is saying then is that the natives live in such a socio-political system. However, the skeptic, who has lived within a radically different form of socio-political organization, a feudal hierarchy, has no conceptual basis with which to properly understand these claims of the believer. He has no concept of elections, referendums, or democracy, nor the related notions of individual rights, equality, liberty, or self-government. He assumes, and cannot imagine otherwise, that the natives belong to a feudal society. The description of a democratically elected office is baffling to him, since he understands this to describe a peculiar kind of feudal rulership, which somehow places upon the ruler the obligation to grant wishes of peasants, which is unlike the governance of any ruler he knows. Therefore, when he hears about the president, the holder of the highest office, it seems to him that the believer is positing the existence of a very peculiar sort of ruler above and in addition to the existing feudal hierarchy of lords and even monarchs, a ruler whose court grants wishes of the lowest peasants. It is also important to note that the very wording of our parable in the beginning would differ depending on who is telling the tale, the skeptic, the believer, or even the natives. Side note, it seems to me that the significance of this, that is, the question of who is crafting the parable, is seldom mentioned in the discussions of the famous article by Anthony Flew, the opening of which my parable consciously mimics, the one by Anthony Flew, R.M. Hare, and Basil Mitchell, Theology and Falsification. I have not stated, quite deliberately, what it is that the natives are really doing. Perhaps the natives are really some rural 19th century Americans voting on a proposition or an election. If so, the believer is correct. Or perhaps they are participating in some elaborate ritual to send their petition to a distant wish-granting ruler. It may even be that this ruler does not exist except as a fanciful tale told by their village elders. If so, the believer is wrong. Not only does the president not exist, but the believer misunderstood what was happening because of his socio-political background. Even if the natives themselves believe that they live in a democracy as the believers understand it, they too might be mistaken. Consider the society of David Brin's The Postman or George Orwell's 1984. Side note, in David Brin, The Postman, a number of people in a post-apocalyptic United States falsely believe that their central government is restored because the main character acts as a postman. In George Orwell's 1984, the entire society is indoctrinated by its tyrannical mind-controlling government to follow its leader, the Big Brother, who, the book reveals, may not even exist. Or consider real-life totalitarian states that pose as democracies with dictators who commit atrocities while being adored by their people. Thus, the skeptic is not necessarily wrong in saying that the benevolent ruler does not exist just because he fails to understand what the believer is saying. What I'm separating here is the question of whether the benevolent ruler exists from the question of how we would go about answering this. Our concern is the latter. How then can the explorers go about resolving their disagreement in our expanded parable? A simple answer may be that unlike God, the president would be someone they could just meet. However, the explorers are seeking an answer now, and even if the president exists, it will likely be a long while, if ever, before they are granted a personal audience with a head of state. On the other hand, numerous religions do claim that many people have met God, and we may even quip here that everyone may yet meet him after death. The more significant problem is that simply meeting the president would not by itself resolve their disagreement any more than meeting someone who is supposedly divine, such as a Hindu guru or say Jesus Christ himself, would compel a skeptic to affirm that God exists. How else can the explorers resolve their disagreement? Consider our problem. The two explorers hold radically different understanding of state, society, governance, and so forth, and thus have different reasons for their positions and even employ different set of vocabulary. Each explorer, for example, understands differently what it is that defines a benevolent ruler as such a ruler. For the believer, such a ruler is the one elected by the nation to represent the will of its people, whereas for the skeptic, such a ruler is the one who grants wishes of the peasantry and to whom all other feudal lords and even monarchs swear fealty. For the believer, the evidence that this ruler exists would simply be an election for such office. To him, this is what it means to have any government, and what the natives did, which he assumes is a referendum or an election, for what else could it be, confirms his claims. The evidence for the skeptic, in contrast, would be a feudal lord, such as a baron, earl, or a daimyo, who swears fealty to this ruler and attests to the ruler's benevolence toward the peasants by granting their wishes in the ruler's stead. He assumes that what he saw is the native peasants offering petitions, for what else could it be? Thus, unless both explorers adequately understand the socio-political system of the other side, any evidence each raises for his position or against the other will not be acknowledged nor understood as an evidence by the other. Furthermore, each will insist that it is the belief of the other that must be justified by sufficient evidence. The skeptic will demand evidence because he sees no reason, one that befits his understanding of government, to posit this ruler in addition to the existing feudal hierarchy. It seems to him that since the petitions of these natives are not granted, what he sees before him is obviously a superstitious ritual born from their wishful thinking. The believer will demand evidence that the president does not exist, because with an election going on, the skeptic is incomprehensibly denying what is even now happening before them. Still, would there not be some form of evidence about the ruler that both would recognize? What about signs of law, order, and infrastructure such as courts, police, schools, hospitals, or roads? Or perhaps centralized currency, taxation, or a military? However, the skeptic may easily concede that these are signs of some sort of governance, but deny that these point to the existence of the benevolent ruler. Such evidences are insufficient because the skeptic can explain these features in other terms, namely as the economic and social infrastructure within a feudal hierarchy without the benevolent ruler. Side note, note how these evidences may be phrased to be a kind of causal or design argument, such as the following. Roads, postal service, schools, military, law enforcement, etc. exist and are organized in this manner because there is a nationally elected governing office that set them up. Rather like, The universe, order in nature, consciousness, etc. exist because there is an intelligent first cause that created and designed them. Consider also how the difficulties of or objections to such arguments would parallel those that typically arise in the debate regarding the cosmological arguments and the various arguments about God from natural science. Thus, the skeptic would still have no need to posit the existence of the benevolent ruler. On the other hand, a similar problem occurs when the skeptic raises evidences against the believer. Places ruled by military occupation, occasions when votes or wishes from one region fail to sway national policies, times of poverty and suffering among the general populace, and even slavery are consistent with a society governed by a democratically elected government. Side note, note how all these features were present in some form in the history of the United States during the 19th century. Also, consider how such a debate would likewise have interesting parallels to the debate regarding arguments from evil or unanswered prayers regarding the existence of God. Thus, again, the explorers cannot evaluate which shared evidence is valid, in what ways, and to what extent, without understanding first how each fits in the socio-political system of the other as a whole. However, is not this account so far unrealistic or even contrived? It begins by supposing that our two explorers would be unable to understand or even notice the differences in their socio-political backgrounds from which they have formed their positions about the native society. Does it not seem unreasonable to suppose that the explorers who are otherwise able to communicate with each other to the extent of having this disagreement would repeatedly fail to realize the rather obvious fact that they are arguing from and about very different socio-political systems using manifestly different set of definitions and arguments? This is true. The point of this parable actually lies elsewhere. That is, if such differences were recognized, it would change the way they view their debate and proceed in it. First, the question of whether the benevolent ruler or the president of the natives exists would become an odd question to ask. That is, it would be odd if, even when the two explorers understood their fundamental differences, their debate still proceeded primarily in terms and questions that consist of whether or not to posit the existence of the benevolent ruler. What the skeptic from a feudal society would more likely question is whether the believer's description of the society the two of them have encountered, with that account's strange notions of individuality, liberty, equality, self-government, and so on, which this benevolent ruler supposedly governs, is an accurate description of the society that the natives live in. Side note, it seems an obvious point to observe that historically, non-Western cultures that encountered accounts of democratic political systems of the West did not seriously question whether a ruler exists in those societies. They did raise questions, but their primary question was whether the idea of democracy and equality that those other societies believed in were workable, and if so, how those ideas could be applied to their own society. So he would ask, for example, if the natives really live as equals, liberated from the constraints of feudal classes. Now, another note, this would be a considerably more difficult question to answer for the explorers than one might expect. Imagine, for example, how one would perceive the differences between the lives of average working class families and the members of Fortune 500 in a modern democratic society if the only categories one possessed to understand the differences were those of a feudal society. At any rate, to once again argue mainly over whether the benevolent ruler exists would be a very awkward way to proceed in their debate. This is not to say that the question whether the benevolent ruler exists is itself incoherent or illegitimate. For example, one may understand such a question to be a rather simplistic way of asking which system of government exists for a particular society. It is quite legitimate to inquire in the first contact, or in the context of, say, social anthropology, whether a particular society has chieftains, oligarchs, monarchs, clerics, presidents, or some other as its head. One may, given the relevant sociological or anthropological data, even coherently present a case that postulates the existence of a particular kind of ruler who likely governs the society. Also, an outsider may know better what sort of society exists than do those on the inside, provided that his or her understanding of such a society is comparable to the understanding its native members have of it. For example, a modern Western sociologist may be better situated to know what kind of socio-political system a particular Amazonian tribe has, or if a South Asian feudal monarchy is going through the process of becoming a constitutional monarchy, or if an autocracy in the Middle East is becoming a democracy, than are the members or citizens of those groups. The problem, rather, is that the question of whether the benevolent ruler exists is situated within and inseparable from the larger question of what sort of society exists. That is, what is being asked is a more comprehensive question that involves numerous inseparably interconnected issues regarding what sort of social concepts, values, organizations, systems of government, jurisprudence, and so forth operate in the native society. Therefore, a likewise comprehensive answer is required for the question whether the president or some sufficiently similar office truly exists in their society. Furthermore, precisely because of this, the final answer need not be limited to whether the office does or does not exist, since a society may have an office that is similar in some respect to the president, yet differs greatly in others. What would be odd then would be if the existence of the benevolent ruler became the primary issue of contention in the debate. That is, if this were where the debate became stuck, so to speak. We may even say that the debate would be stuck here only if the two explorers had somehow failed to grasp in significant ways this difference in their socio-political positions. This brings us to a second point. It would be odd if both explorers, given their socio-political backgrounds, did not agree, at least provisionally, that a ruler of some kind that governs the natives exists. What they would disagree about is not the existence of the ruler per se, but his benevolence, or rather the nature of his office. The question of contention is about the society in which the ruler governs, whether the native society is closer to a feudal monarchy or a liberal democracy, which is a comparative question. Side note, of course, it is possible that the natives are living in a small tribal society or even a state of anarchy with no higher ruler. However, for these two explorers, this would require more than a mere refutation of this or that evidence for their respective positions. It would require a development or even construction of a hitherto utterly unimagined concept with its own unique set of social features. Going back, thus, rather than the existence of the ruler being the primary point of disagreement, it would likely be the starting point of agreement from which further questions could be asked. Moreover, it would again be odd to expect that only one position, as stated initially, must be right regarding everything about the native society and the other entirely wrong. It may be that in some respect the believer is right, and in others the skeptic, and yet in some others both or neither. Indeed, we would not be too surprised if we found that the final answer was developed at least partially from both positions. Third, if all this were to be so, it would be odd if the skeptic continued to consider this debate largely in terms of the believer presenting evidence for his position, which was then to be defended or refuted. That is, it would be odd for the skeptic to claim that without evidence for liberal democracy, the debate is resolved in his favor by default. Both explorers are proposing that the natives belong to their particular form of socio-political organization. The question is not whether to posit the existence of the benevolent ruler, or even whether the native society is a liberal democracy per se. Rather, it is a comparative question about which of the two views, liberal democracy or feudal monarchy as a whole, is closer to how the native society functions, and both sides must present their cases. However, the difficulty is that an adequate answer to this comparative question can be given only by someone who is fluent, so to speak, in both socio-political forms and can therefore assess the correctness of each position regarding a particular aspect of Native society by its own standards. For example, if the believer's position regarding the Native society on the subject of, say, equality of individuals is wrong, it must be shown to have failed by its own terms of what such equality is and what constitutes evidence for it, and not by the skeptic's term, that is, by the standard of a feudal monarchy. Let us finally return to my first remark. What I'm proposing is that the way we argue about the existence of God is odd, and for the same reason that the way the skeptic and the believer in the parable argued is odd. And that's a good point to stop, I think. If you're interested in the rest of the book, you can buy it in Amazon and various other places, or the less costly option is that you can check the nearest college or university library near you. Even if they don't have a copy, you can request it, and you can probably get it off an interlibrary loan, or they'll buy a copy. Again, if you enjoy this series, please subscribe, follow, or share, or on iTunes rate the podcast. And until next time, I will be waiting here.